But when you take all of that together, it reveals a deeper issue, one that cuts to the core of Sola Scriptura itself. It imposes an unexplained and unjustified limit on how God guides his people. When we see a restriction or a limit, we naturally ask, why does this limit actually exist?
He said here with this new argument, this argument one allegedly the strongest, that it restricts how God guides his people. Hold up. We can still think that God is guiding the church, God is guiding tradition. That doesn't mean that the human authorities are infallible. You can think that God guides us through our lives, our day-to-day lives. God is guiding us. It doesn't mean we're infallible. It doesn't mean that the bishop or the pope, when he speaks ex cathedra, is perfectly without error. What is the logical connection there between thinking that if God guides a fallen human, that the fallen human will be perfect and never err? Why would we think that?
For example, if a scientist claimed that gravity only applies in 10% of the universe, the immediate question would be, why only 10%? Why not 11%? Why not 100%? If no good reason can be given, the claim starts to look arbitrary.
We've already given good reasons. One, Cameron's arguments have not been against Sola Scriptura, but two, last week we went through Calvin's letter where he argued about the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church and how far they've gone awry, and how the Reformation is the recovery of the church tradition.
Limit imposed without justification. The exact same principle applies here. Sola Scriptura says that God's infallible guidance is limited to 66 written books and nothing else. No binding tradition, no authoritative church, no spirit-protected interpretation.
He says, no binding tradition, no binding church. This is an attack against Sola Scriptura, not Sola Scriptura. This is an attack against something other than what Bertuzzi defined at the start of this video. So this is just some shoddy arguments, once again, from Cameron.
Beyond the text. But why? What explains this limit?
What explains the limit? Let's take the best form. Let's steel man here. What explains the best form? Well, because Scripture is divinely inspired. We know that Scripture is divinely inspired. We know that, yes, the church as an authority came to conclude which books belong in the canon. They had warranted reasons for thinking so. And so the early church themselves decided, hey, these are the bounds. These are the bounds of the God-spoken words. So it's not arbitrary. Sola Scriptura is not arbitrary. The church fathers themselves came to realize what books contained divine teaching and which ones did not. And yes, we can take their authority. We can use their authority. It's not infallible authority. It's fallible, but it's correct. It's fallible authority that is correct. For some reason, some people think if you say it's fallible, then it's always wrong. No. Fallible authority can be right 99.9% of the time, but if they're wrong just 0.1% of the time, they are a fallible authority.
Some theological limits do actually have an explanation. So for example, Richard Swinburne has argued that the doctrine of the Trinity, something we've already talked about, a limit of 3 divine persons, is explained by the nature of love. A single person can't love another, and 2 persons only love each other. But 3 allows for communal love to exist eternally within God himself. So in this case, the limit of 3 has an inherent rational basis. But that explanation doesn't work for Sola Scriptura. Nothing about God's nature requires him to communicate only through written text. Nothing about God's love, for example, explains why he would only speak in 66 books, but not 67. If 66 books are compatible with his loving nature, why not 73? Why not a combination of written and oral guidance, as we see in Scripture itself? But if the limit isn't found in God's nature, maybe it's found in God's reasons, some purported purpose behind restricting his guidance to a fixed set of books. To take another example, Swinburne has argued that God has good reasons to become incarnate, such as to participate in human suffering. A general sending his soldiers to war should at the very least consider fighting alongside them. That's a reasoned justification for the incarnation. So what would be the reason for limiting divine guidance to exactly 66 written books? What purpose would this restriction serve? Would it ensure clarity? Well, if so, why?
Again, we still have an argument against Sola Scriptura. So don't be going down. Don't be drinking the Kool-Aid that he's putting out right now.
Sola Scriptura led to division rather than unity, as we saw in argument number 8. Would it give believers confidence? Well, so why does the canon problem leave Protestants uncertain about which books belong, as we saw in argument number 5?
Already dealt with
Would
that
it
one.
allow Christians to follow God's truth more faithfully? Well, if so, then why does Sola Scriptura force every believer to become their own final authority, as we saw in argument number 7? At every
Already
turn
dealt
that we
with that
take,
one.
the very reasons one might...
Every turn we take, literally every argument that Cameron has presented has not been, quite literally, it's not been an argument against Sola Scriptura. Every single one. This has not been a video against Sola Scriptura. It's been a video against solo Scripture. This idea that Scripture is the only authority, period. But that is not the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. Literally every one of the 9 arguments.
Expect for this limit are undermined by the problems Sola Scriptura creates. The more we look for a justification, the more this limit appears to be arbitrary, a rule imposed without reason. If this were truly God's plan, we would expect 1. A biblical statement affirming it, but we don't have one. 2. A historical moment where Christians recognized it as the rule of faith, but history shows the opposite. 3. Evidence that it produced unity and doctrinal clarity, but it hasn't.
He's just
4.
rehashing his arguments
a way
a
for
second
believers
time
in Sola
here.
Scriptura to reliably know what belongs in Scripture, but there isn't one. In other words, when we look at history, Scripture, and reason, there doesn't seem to be an obvious explanation for this particular limit.
This is why I spent last week on the side quest. He said, when we look at Christian history, we don't see an obvious reason. I gave it to you pretty darn clearly last week, and I'd wager that Bertuzzi has not read John Calvin's letter to Sadaletto, because it's clear that this is the historical basis for it.